Night presses down on the northern plain of Saint-Domingue, heavy with heat and the smell of sugarcane. Torches flicker between the rows, not for harvest, but for signal. Steel flashes once, then again. In the darkness, a plantation house burns from the inside out, flames climbing white stone walls built to look permanent. Drums begin to beat, slow at first, then faster, carrying across fields that have never been silent before. By morning, the most profitable colony on Earth will be at war with itself. Stay with this story all the way to the end, because what begins here as fire in the cane fields will end by shattering an empire, redrawing the global economy, and forcing the world to confront a truth it had spent centuries trying to bury. The uprising does not come from nowhere. It rises out of a system already stretched to the breaking point, a system so efficient, so brutal, that it cannot survive its own success. Before the fires, before the armies, Saint-Domingue is an engine. Sugar and coffee pour out of its ports in quantities no other colony can match. By the late 18th century, this single French possession produces roughly 40% of the sugar consumed in Europe and more than half of its coffee. The wealth generated here underwrites French commerce, feeds global trade networks, and props up credit systems from Bordeaux to Paris. On paper, Saint-Domingue looks like a miracle of productivity. In reality, it is a machine that consumes human lives at a terrifying rate. The colony's population tells the story more clearly than any ledger. Fewer than 40,000 white colonists sit atop a society of more than 500,000 enslaved Africans. Between them exists a smaller but complex group of free people of color, many of them property owners, some educated in France, all trapped in a racial hierarchy designed to keep power rigidly controlled. The imbalance is extreme, even by colonial standards. Death rates among the enslaved are so high that the population can only be sustained through constant importation from Africa. People are worked until they collapse, replaced, and forgotten, while ships continue to arrive with new captives to feed the plantations. Violence is not incidental to this system. It is foundational. Enslaved labor is maintained through surveillance, punishment, and terror calibrated to extract maximum output. Whipping posts stand as permanent fixtures. Mutilation is legally sanctioned. Entire codes of law exist not to protect life, but to manage its destruction efficiently. The plantation landscape itself is designed for control, with fields laid out for visibility, housing segregated by status, and armed overseers positioned to respond quickly to resistance. Every detail reinforces a single truth. Saint-Domingue runs on force. Yet the colony is not stable. It is under pressure from every direction at once. The French Revolution sends shockwaves across the Atlantic, introducing radical ideas about liberty and rights that destabilize colonial authority. White planters argue among themselves, some demanding autonomy from France, others clinging to royal protection. Free people of color petition for equality, pointing to revolutionary declarations that promise universal rights while denying them in practice. Enslaved laborers, listening carefully, hear these contradictions echoed through rumor, prayer, and whispered conversation. The system depends on silence, but silence is no longer possible. Economic success worsens the strain. As sugar and coffee profits rise, expectations rise with them. Planters demand more production, tighter discipline, longer hours. The pace accelerates, and the margin for error disappears. Small acts of resistance, sabotage, and flight increase. Marronage, the escape of enslaved people into the mountains, becomes more frequent. Networks of communication form across plantations, carried by drivers, artisans, and domestic workers who move between estates. Information flows despite every effort to contain it. Geography plays its part. Saint-Domingue is not just plantations and ports. Its interior is mountainous, dense, and difficult to control. Forests and highlands provide refuge, training ground, and concealment. Those who flee do not simply vanish. They survive, organize, and remember. The colony's very terrain undermines the illusion of total dominance. What makes Saint-Domingue uniquely dangerous to itself is the scale at which all of this operates simultaneously. There is no release valve. Political reform threatens planter power. Racial equality threatens the caste system. Any reduction in violence threatens profitability. The colony cannot bend without breaking. It can only tighten, and tightening accelerates collapse. French officials know this, even if they refuse to admit it openly. Reports circulate warning of unrest, of secret gatherings, of religious ceremonies blending African traditions with revolutionary language. Plantation owners dismiss these warnings as exaggerations, confident that fear and force will hold. They have held before, they will hold again, or so they believe. But beneath the surface, something irreversible is forming. Enslaved men and women are not only enduring violence, they are learning from it. They observe military routines, understand supply lines, recognize the vulnerabilities of the plantation system because they operate it every day. They know where food is stored, where weapons are kept, how signals travel, how quickly help can arrive. They know which overseers hesitate and which panic. This knowledge does not look like power yet, but it is. By the summer of 1791, Saint-Domingue is no longer merely a colony under strain. It is a pressure vessel. Every harvest season, every shipment to Europe, every decree from Paris adds another turn of the screw. The wealth that makes the colony indispensable also makes it fragile. Its dependence on absolute control creates a single point of failure. The moment fear changes sides. When the torches are lit in the cane fields, it will not be an accident or a spontaneous riot. It will be the release of years of accumulated tension, guided by people who understand exactly how the system works because they built it with their own hands. What follows will not be chaos alone, but transformation. And once the first plantation falls, nothing in the Atlantic world will ever be quite the same again. The first flames spread faster than anyone in Cap Français expects. What begins as scattered fires along the northern plain becomes a rolling front of destruction, plantation after plantation collapsing into smoke and embers. Cane fields that once moved only at the command of overseers now crackle with heat and shouting voices. Storehouses are broken open. Sugar mills are smashed apart piece by piece, not in blind fury, but with deliberate precision. The revolt is no longer a rumor carried on the wind. It is visible from the roads, from the hills, from the decks of ships anchored offshore. At first, colonial authorities mistake the uprising for what they have always feared and always underestimated: an uncoordinated explosion of rage. They assume hunger, superstition, or outside agitation must be to blame. They believe it will burn itself out once troops arrive. But within days, that assumption collapses. The attacks are not random. Plantations are targeted selectively. Some are spared. Others are destroyed completely. Messages move faster than horses. Signals are relayed by drumbeats, horns, and runners who know the terrain better than any soldier sent to stop them. Leadership emerges not through proclamation, but through necessity. Men who have worked as drivers, craftsmen, and foremen step forward because they already understand command. They organize groups into units, assign roles, and enforce discipline. Looting is controlled. Food is redistributed. Weapons captured from plantation arsenals are repaired and reused. The revolt begins to resemble an army in formation, shaped by people who have spent their lives watching armies enforce order against them. Violence escalates, but it does so with structure. Plantation houses are destroyed not just as symbols, but as strategic nodes. Burning them denies shelter and supply to colonial militias. Killing overseers removes immediate threats. The enslaved population understands exactly where power lives on each estate because they have lived under it for years. This knowledge transforms social rebellion into military action. French troops respond with familiar tactics: columns, volleys, reprisals meant to terrorize the population into submission. They find these methods ineffective. Rebel forces do not hold ground conventionally. They melt into forests and ravines, reappearing where least expected. European formations trained for open battle struggle against fighters who choose when and where to engage. The terrain itself becomes an ally to the uprising, swallowing armies that move too slowly or predictably. Out of this chaos, Toussaint Louverture begins to rise. At first, he is not the central figure history will later remember. He appears on the margins, advising, organizing, moving between factions. His power comes not from spectacle, but from logistics and restraint. He emphasizes training, supply discipline, and intelligence. He understands that survival depends on more than courage. It depends on coherence. Louverture's influence becomes visible in the changing character of the rebellion. Units begin drilling. Guards are posted. Lines of communication tighten. The uprising absorbs deserters, freed people, and experienced fighters into a growing force that learns from every engagement. European military practices are studied, adapted, and subverted. The rebels are no longer merely reacting, they are anticipating. The colonial government's authority erodes rapidly. White planters flee toward ports or fortify their homes, uncertain whom they can trust. Free people of color, caught between revolution and repression, are forced to choose sides in a conflict that offers no neutrality. French officials issue decrees promising reforms they cannot enforce. Every attempt to regain control exposes how little control remains. What terrifies observers most is not the destruction, but the speed of adaptation. Within months, a population systematically denied education and military training has created a functioning war effort. This defies every assumption embedded in colonial ideology. The revolt is not supposed to think, plan, or endure. Yet it does all three. External powers begin paying attention. Spanish authorities in neighboring Santo Domingo watch carefully, recognizing opportunity in French weakness. British naval commanders take note of the ports and supply routes slipping out of French hands. The uprising is no longer a domestic crisis. It is becoming a strategic variable in an already unstable Atlantic world. For the people fighting on the ground, the stakes sharpen. What began as resistance hardens into something else entirely. There is no returning to the old order now. Every burned plantation, every defeated column, closes the door further behind them. Survival demands victory. Defeat means retribution beyond imagination. By the end of this phase, Saint-Domingue is no longer a colony in revolt. It is a battlefield where enslaved people have proven they can organize, fight, and endure against one of Europe's most powerful empires. The uprising has crossed a threshold. It cannot be contained as a local disturbance anymore. It has become a war that other nations will soon be forced to enter, whether they want to or not. Warships appear on the horizon long before any declarations are made. Their silhouettes linger offshore, watching ports choke with refugees and smoke. What began as an internal rupture inside a French colony now draws the attention of empires that understand exactly what is at stake. Saint-Domingue is no longer just burning, it is exposed. And in the late 18th century Atlantic world, exposure invites intervention. France itself is changing even faster than the colony it is trying to control. Revolution in Paris tears apart the old order, replacing royal authority with radical uncertainty. Power shifts between factions. Laws are rewritten, then rewritten again. Commissioners are sent to Saint-Domingue, carrying ideals of liberty they barely understand and promises they cannot fully enforce. Their arrival brings confusion rather than clarity. They speak of rights while relying on troops trained to deny them. They proclaim equality while depending on a plantation economy that cannot function without coercion. Sensing weakness, Spain and Britain move quickly. Spanish authorities in Santo Domingo offer weapons and support to rebel leaders willing to fight France, seeing an opportunity to destabilize their rival. British planners, eyeing Saint-Domingue's ports and trade routes, calculate the colony's value in cold strategic terms. Control the island, and you control the flow of sugar, coffee, and influence across the Caribbean. What began as a slave uprising is now entangled in a global contest for power. Toussaint Louverture navigates this chaos with careful calculation. He aligns with Spain at first, not out of loyalty, but necessity. Spanish arms and recognition provide breathing room and legitimacy. Louverture studies European command structures closely, adopting ranks, uniforms, and discipline that make his forces legible to foreign powers. He understands that survival now depends on being taken seriously as a military and political actor, not merely a rebel commander. Meanwhile, France makes a decision that will reshape the conflict entirely. Facing the reality that it cannot suppress the uprising through force alone, the revolutionary government issues decrees abolishing slavery in the colonies. It is a stunning reversal, driven less by moral awakening than by desperation. Freedom becomes a weapon, offered to secure loyalty and stabilize a collapsing front. The effect is immediate and profound. Thousands who had fought against French authority now have a reason to fight for it. Louverture switches allegiance, bringing his experienced army into the French Republican camp. The war transforms overnight. Former enemies become allies. Former masters lose legal claim to human property. The lines of conflict redraw themselves, not along race alone, but along shifting definitions of citizenship, loyalty, and survival. European armies flood the island, and they suffer for it. Tropical disease decimates troops unused to the climate. Yellow fever cuts through regiments faster than any battlefield engagement. Supply chains strain under constant attack. Every hill, forest, and road becomes contested ground. The Caribbean, once imagined as a source of wealth and leisure, reveals itself as a lethal theater of war. Naval blockades tighten. Ports change hands repeatedly. British forces capture key cities, only to lose them again. Spanish troops advance, then withdraw. No empire can hold ground for long without bleeding resources. Saint-Domingue becomes a sinkhole for manpower and money, draining attention from European battlefields even as wars rage across the continent. Through it all, Louverture consolidates power. He builds administrative systems alongside military ones, reopening plantations under paid labor, restoring production to stabilize the economy. This decision is controversial, even among his supporters, but it reflects a grim understanding. Independence without food, revenue, and order will collapse. The revolution must sustain itself or be crushed by the very freedoms it has unleashed. By the late 1790s, the conflict has fully internationalized. What began as an uprising by enslaved people now forces the world's most powerful states to react, adapt, and negotiate. Saint-Domingue dictates imperial strategy rather than submitting to it. The island's fate influences treaties, military deployments, and economic policy across the Atlantic. And yet, the most dangerous moment still lies ahead. In Europe, a new figure rises, one who sees the colony not as a revolutionary partner, but as a lost asset to be reclaimed. For him, emancipation is temporary, a tactical error to be corrected. The war has already consumed empires, but its final phase will test whether freedom itself can survive contact with absolute power. The French expedition arrives in waves, white sails filling the horizon like a closing wall. Veterans of Europe's bloodiest campaigns disembark with polished muskets and formal orders, convinced they are here to restore order, not to negotiate it. Napoleon Bonaparte has no interest in compromise. To him, Saint-Domingue is not a revolution to be understood, but a possession to be reclaimed. Its sugar fields are too valuable, its example too dangerous. Freedom, once granted, can be revoked. General Charles Leclerc, Napoleon's brother-in-law, carries sealed instructions and absolute authority. Publicly, he speaks the language of reconciliation. Privately, he prepares for total control. The expedition is vast by colonial standards. Tens of thousands of troops, warships, artillery, and administrators sent to impose French will by force if necessary. On paper, it is overwhelming. In reality, it walks into a war it does not understand. Toussaint Louverture knows what is coming long before the first troops land. He has seen European politics up close. He understands how quickly revolutionary ideals can be sacrificed to imperial ambition. His response is measured, almost restrained. He avoids open confrontation at first, testing French intentions, watching how officers treat the black generals who have been their allies. When arrests begin, when promises dissolve into coercion, the illusion collapses. This is not peace, it is a prelude. The war shifts tone immediately. Louverture orders scorched earth tactics that deny the French supplies and shelter. Towns are evacuated, fields burned, roads sabotaged. The countryside empties ahead of advancing columns, forcing European troops into hostile terrain without food or intelligence. Every mile gained costs lives, not in battle alone, but through exhaustion and disease. Yellow fever returns with devastating efficiency, striking down soldiers who have survived years of European warfare only to die in tropical heat. French commanders respond with escalating brutality. Executions multiply. Entire communities are punished to break resistance. The goal is not just victory, but deterrence. Napoleon intends to make Saint-Domingue an example. Instead, he hardens opposition beyond reconciliation. Fighters who might have accepted autonomy now face annihilation. The conflict becomes existential. Louverture is eventually captured through deception rather than defeat. Summoned under false assurances of safety, he is arrested and deported to France, removed from the island he helped reshape. He dies imprisoned in the cold mountains of the Jura, far from the heat that forged him. Napoleon believes the war is effectively over. He is wrong. Leadership passes to Jean-Jacques Dessalines, a commander forged in the harshest phases of the conflict. Where Louverture balanced diplomacy and restraint, Dessalines embraces clarity. There will be no return to French rule, no coexistence with slavery in any form. The war becomes total, not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. Survival demands finality. French losses accelerate. Disease decimates reinforcements faster than ships can replace them. Supply lines crumble. Morale collapses as soldiers realize they are fighting an enemy that cannot be terrorized into submission. The same plantation system, meant to generate wealth, now ensures French vulnerability, tying troops to fixed positions that rebels avoid or encircle at will. Napoleon's strategy unravels. The Caribbean drains resources he needs in Europe. Every regiment lost in Saint-Domingue weakens his campaigns elsewhere. What was meant to restore imperial dominance instead exposes its limits. Power built on forced labor proves brittle when confronted by people who have nothing left to lose. By the end of this phase, the question is no longer whether France can retake the colony, but how quickly it can escape a war that has become unwinnable. The expedition withdraws in failure, leaving behind burned towns, mass graves, and a hardened revolutionary army that understands the cost of freedom with painful clarity. Saint-Domingue has crossed another threshold. The fight is no longer about reform or autonomy. It is about existence itself, and there will be no compromise at the end of it. The declaration comes not with celebration, but with exhaustion. After 13 years of fire, betrayal, disease, and war, the land itself seems to pause. On the first day of 1804, Saint-Domingue is renamed Haiti, reclaiming an indigenous name long buried beneath colonial maps. It is more than a change of title. It is a rejection of the entire world that tried to own it. Haiti is born victorious and isolated at the same time. No empire rushes to recognize it. No major power welcomes the precedent it sets. An army of formerly enslaved people has defeated France, Britain, and Spain in succession, and that reality terrifies societies built on slavery and racial hierarchy. Silence becomes a weapon. Trade is restricted, diplomacy withheld. The young nation is treated not as a triumph of independence, but as a threat to be contained. The cost of that fear is immense. France, having failed to reconquer Haiti, demands compensation instead. In exchange for diplomatic recognition, it imposes an indemnity so vast it cripples the country's economy for generations. Haiti is forced to pay for the loss of its former master's property, including the people who freed themselves. It is an irony so severe, it borders on the unimaginable. The first Black Republic in history begins its existence in debt to the empire it defeated. Globally, the consequences ripple outward. Napoleon's failure in the Caribbean reshapes his ambitions. The collapse of the Saint-Domingue expedition contributes directly to the decision to sell Louisiana to the United States. altering the future of an entire continent. Across Europe and the Americas, slaveholding societies quietly tighten controls, haunted by the knowledge that revolt can succeed. At the same time, enslaved people everywhere listen closely, drawing hope from Haiti's survival against impossible odds. Inside the new nation, freedom proves harder to govern than to win. War has destroyed infrastructure, drained population, and left deep scars. Leaders must balance defense, agriculture, and political unity while surrounded by hostile powers. The revolution that shattered empires now faces the slower, quieter struggle of endurance. There are no foreign saviors. There is only the work of rebuilding on ground soaked with history. And yet, Haiti endures, not as a myth or a footnote, but as a fact that cannot be erased. It stands as proof that the most violent systems can be broken by those they are designed to crush. That people denied everything can still organize, strategize, and prevail. That imagination, discipline, and resolve can overturn empires built on certainty. The Haitian Revolution does not offer a comfortable legacy. It leaves behind questions rather than answers. It exposes the hypocrisy of liberty preached but withheld. It reveals how power reacts when challenged from below. And it reminds the world that the price of freedom is often paid long after the fighting ends. They did not simply escape slavery. They defeated the forces that defined it as permanent. And in doing so, they changed the course of history, whether the world was ready to admit it or not.